So let's just look at the assignment itself and walk through it. So this is due a month from now. So you're going to create 3 illustrations of Homo naledi, the partial mandible digital model. It's available at MorphoSource, but I've downloaded it for you already. These are the 3 views that we're going to be doing, like I described. And you're going to include some supplemental illustrations to go along with this. So I want you to read the paper that's published about Homo naledi and identify what some of these diagnostic features are. So I don't lay them out exactly in here, but I identify the areas I want you to look at. We'll get to that in a second. So this will be rendered in pen, again, ultimately, but instead of doing the fine line work you did before, this will be a lot of stippling, a lot of this, for a long time. It's a kind of more forgiving than the one you did before where you make a mistake, it's a mistake. If you make one wrong dot, it's one wrong dot out of 1,000. So, and to me, it's actually, it's easier for somebody who's coming into the field to start with this because it'll look terrible while you're working on it, and then when you shrink it down a little bit, it's going to look beautiful. It's like magic. So the workflow, I want you to build on the knowledge that you have. So I'm not going to be too explicit about every single step because you're going to use similar workflow to what you did before or what you've just finished. So again, we're going to start in Maya and we're going to light the object from the upper left, and you're going to have to move that light around when you want to render from the different views. So it's got to be lit from the upper left based on the layout that it's going to be on the page. And I've got a beautiful drawing here of the layout for you. So we're going to have the occlusal surface here, the anterior surface here, the left lateral surface here. So that means we want them all to appear as if the light is coming from the upper left here. Okay? So when you go into Maya, you're going to have to plan that. And I'm going to demonstrate that in just a minute. And what we're also going to see in just a second is that you can shade the surface in different ways. And when I talk about surface shading, I mean defining the qualities of the surface, how shiny it is, how it reacts to light, how shadows appear on the surface. Those things can be very informative for when you want to do your drawing, and I'm going to show you how that's going to work. So I talk about rendering using a tune shader and a matte shader here, and I'll show you that in a minute. Using a fill light and a key light, and we'll talk about those terms in just a second. And then there's another render you have to do to show the mandibular symphysis. So just before we go any further, let's talk about the anatomy of the mandible. So some of you know this already. So this is either a chimp or an orangutan. I can't remember, I don't have the label on it. But so we're dealing with a hominin. This is a hominin too, but this is, I guess, a hominid. So, mandible. This part that comes up here, you can feel it yourself, that articulates with your skull. This is called the mandibular ramus. You've got the condyle and epicondyle up here, so this is the part that goes into your temporomandibular joint. And then down here, this sort of more horizontal part, this is called the mandibular body. Going from the ramus, and I can't show you because we don't have it on the model exactly, but from the ramus going down into the body, there's an edge going down here. This is called the oblique line that goes down. And it goes towards this hole, which is a very important diagnostic feature between Australopithecines and genus Homo, the positioning of this. This is called the mental foramen. Okay, so you're going to have to look at that up in the article. It's called mental because the chin in anatomical terms is called your mental eminence. It's the mental region. And so foramen means a hole, so this is the mental foramen here. the part where the teeth or articulate with the mandible is called the alveolar process. You can see that term. There's going to be a measurement you'll have to make based on where the alveolar process is, this long edge going along here. And this is the bottom, the edge of the mandible. And then in the middle here, so on your mandible, if you just gently feel under here, you can feel the midline. In development, when your face is developing, the mandible comes together and fuses here. It forms a symphysis. So symphysis means coming together. And so the mandibular symphysis, sometimes you can see remnants of it here, like on this chip, there's a slight edge in there. But the symphysis is an important diagnostic feature between more ape-like and more human-like. So you have to look at that too. Particularly if you imagine cutting this thing in half and seeing the shape of the symphysis there, that's a very diagnostic feature for primitive and derived traits of hominins. Okay, and so they're primates just like us, same teeth essentially. You've got 3 molars, so the ones in the back are the 3 molars. You got premolars, 1 and 2. And then, this one, the canine, and then you've got your lateral and central incisors. So they're going to be referring to certain things in the article, and so you'll have to know that. If you don't know that, go look it up. So some of you who maybe had more experience in hsc classes before, but not a lot of experience with anatomy and things like that, it might have been easier for you. This might be a little more easy for people with some experience in paleoanthropology or human anatomy and things like that. Sorry, I didn't mean to point at you.
I don't mind.
So you can see here in my little drawing of the anterior view, showing where the symphysis is and what the profile of that symphysis would look like. So what we can do with 3D technology is take our scan of the object, cut it in different places without damaging anything, and we can see those profiles and measure them. And that's what you're going to be doing with this. So let's just pop into Maya here, and I'll show you what we want to do with the lighting and set up for the render. And I'm going to give you a chance to work on this today because I want to make sure everything's working for everybody before going on any further. But at this point, just if you could, just pay attention to what I'm doing. So you will see in your scene, again, you've got your 4 views. You've got your top view where we see the occlusal surface, front and side views, and then your perspective view here. Remember, if you tap your space bar, you maximize those views. And if your mouse settings are set up correctly, with the Option key held down and the right mouse button, you can zoom in and out. The left mouse button, you can tumble around. And the middle mouse button can track back and forth. And if you want to see the lighting on the object, you remember you have to hit 7 on your keyboard. If I hit 5, it shows shading, but it doesn't react to the position of the lights. Now I think there should be 2 lights in your scene, one here and one here. I'm going to turn on my selection highlighting. And if you hit 7 on the keyboard, and then when you move these lights around, just like you did before, you'll see that light change on the surface. So we want to light this view from the upper left. So I use the perspective view to move my camera around so I can easily position things. And when you want to move something, you can hit W on the keyboard. If it's like this and you hit W, it'll give you these manipulators. So you can move by grabbing these arrows to lock it in that axis of movement. Or you can grab this little square that locks it into 2 axes of movement, the X and Z, and Y is pointed up. So, or you can just grab it in the middle and freely move it around. But you're going to have to move around to make sure that it's being lit from the upper left. Here. And remember our rule from before, when we light something for scientific illustration, we generally speaking want it to be sort of 3/4 in light, 1/4 in core shadow, or 2/3, 1/3, somewhere in that neighborhood, depending on how much surface texture you want to show. So I can pop back and forth between these views, or I can keep them all open, and I can look at my front view here to see if I'm getting the lighting that I want. So if I brought it over here, this lighting is no good because it's straight on, and it's not showing us enough form. It's too much in front. So I want to make sure I'm off to the left. And then the distance that I'm from the object is going to be important. Let me just turn off. You see all these blue planes that I've got floating around here? I'm using these as backers for rendering again, so it's easier to see the outline, so it's not just against white or black. So that brings up this little menu set down here, down towards the lower right. You can see there's a tab that says Display, and I've set it up so you can turn these things off. So the anterior background plane, I can turn that on and off. In this case, I want that one turned on. The midline plane is this one going through the midline. So the midline means this is the sagittal midline here. I'm going to turn that off so it's not bugging us right now. So I'd want to position this so it's from the upper left. It's casting a good amount of light on the surface. If I go in closer, you can see that I get more core shadow. That's too much core shadow. You need some core shadow to show form, but you don't want so much that you've just got a big dark area where you're not seeing very much detail. So something like this could be good. Now you'll see that there's some brightness coming in here too, and if you remember from when we talked about light and form, we want to light something with a main light, a key light from the upper left, so it's going to give us our majority of incidental light on the surface, and then we're going to fall into core shadow over here, but we don't want to go into perfect blackness. We want to simulate some reflected light going up to pick out the details in there. And so that's why you may notice that there's a second light in the scene here. And this is a fill light, so we call that a fill light. If you're doing with photography, you'd have a key light and then a reflecting board under here that would just pick up some light and reflect it back up. But in 3D, we just do it with an extra light. So let's look at these lights for a second. So these are point lights, and when you select them, you can see that their attributes show up over here on the right side. This is the key light that I have selected right now. And one of the things you can change is its intensity. So if you just look down here under key light shape, it's got an intensity of 1. If I turn that up to 2, it makes the scene brighter. If I turn it up to 5, it starts to blow out the scene. So for the key light, probably 1 is just fine. But for the light down here, the fill light, you never want it to be as bright as the key light. Again, if you remember from our talk about light on form, when we've got the light struck region falling into the halftone region, falling into core shadow, and then we've got reflected light should always be a bit dimmer than the halftone region, right? So I have it set to 0.2 right now. So that's giving us a representation of the form like this, where it's mostly bathed in light, but where we have this big valley cut into the mental region, we see some good core shadow to show off that form. We see nice core shadow on the teeth. And we've got a piece of core shadow here that shows the form of the mandible and how it's turning away. But then this fill light down here just picks out this lower edge for us a little bit so it doesn't go into pure darkness. So we can see that the underside of the mandible turns under in the nature the way in which it does that. Does that make sense to everybody? You're just lighting it so you want to light it the way you want to draw it. So there's another thing to consider here. I've set this up to use a 3D model in a way that you couldn't use a photograph. I use as a way to understand my object a little better. And if you think back when we talked about light on form, I showed a face, and then I showed a very faceted face, where it showed the light regions in very discrete units. And we can do a similar thing on a 3D model like this. So right now this has got a shader on the surface. So a shader defines the color and the reflective qualities of the surface. But if we select the mandible here, and if I right click on it, you get this contextual menu. Oops. You get this contextual menu, and if you go right down to the bottom, you can say assign, I know this is at the bottom of the screen, it's hard to see, assign existing material, and there are a bunch of different ones here, but the two that we're going to be using for this model are the toon shader and the matte shader. Right now the matte shader is on it, but if I turn on the toon shader, oh, I had the background thing selected too, but you can see that the quality of the surface changes. And we have this kind of fall off over the surface that is sort of a quantum fall off. It's in discrete jumps. So whereas before we had smooth shading, now we've got this big bright white area with these little islands of discrete gray going into a darker gray, back into sort of that mid-tone gray, and then to a lighter gray again. So if I just look at this here, and you don't really need to make these changes, but in the toon shader, if you can see this, this represents what the color on the surface is going to look like. So rather than lighting it realistically, what we're doing is putting a ramp on it. So a ramp is a gradation of colors. And you can see a representation of that ramp here. And it goes from this kind of light gray to a dark gray, lighter gray, to the lightest gray. So this is our light struck region, this is our halftone region, this is our core shadow region, and then this is our reflected light region. And the way that this works is that it puts these colors on the surface based on the angle from which the light is pointing at it. So for this one, we want to turn off that little fill light. So you're going to be rendering out an image like this, and this is what you're going to be using for guiding your stipple density. It's almost like color by numbers in some ways. So I've just got this light down here, and I'm going to turn off the fill light, just turn it to 0, the intensity. So when you're using the toon shader, you don't want to use the fill light. You just want to have the key light turned on. Okay? So let me just render this out so we can see what it's going to look like. We'll stop for a break in just a minute. So this is called non-photorealistic rendering because we're applying a non-realistic type of shader to the surface. And we've also got this black outline that I've imposed on this. So you're going to be rendering this out. You're going to take it into Photoshop. You're going to scale it like we did before. I'll show you how to do it in Photoshop today. But then you're going to be tracing this by hand. Now, one thing that's different in this assignment is that you don't have to do the first step of doing the outlines in Illustrator. You could if you wanted to, but I kind of included that one to give you a chance to learn it. But in my life, I hate Illustrator, so I would rather just draw something by hand. So you're going to take this, print it out, and you're going to trace over it with your vellum directly. So you're going to skip that first stage. Now, if you really want to use Illustrator to do the outlines of this thing, go right ahead. I don't care. But you don't have to. I think your life would be easier without doing it. So when you're doing the stippling, what you're going to have is the light struck region, which will have a very loose stipple, so very few dots, not densely packed. And then in this next gray level, you're going to have more densely packed stipples. And then, so for example, here it goes from the light gray to the bright gray again to the light gray, and that will show form. And so when you're doing this, you're just using this as a guide to know exactly where to stipple in. And then when it goes into core shadow like this, then you go into a darker area, go back to the mid-tone, darker area here. We're not getting much of this. I would probably move my light so we got a little more reflected light in here. So move my light back over this way again. Do you want to get that reflected light picked up in there a bit? So after we take a break, I'll show you a quick demo of the drawing and stippling. But this is really a very simple guide, and if you follow this for these different regions of stipple density, then you're going to get a good result. You're also going to do some line work drawing the outline of this thing. So some solid lines, some stipple, some areas that will be, the shading will only be defined by stipple, some areas you'll include lines. So that's what you're going to have to decide. Now this black line gives us some indication of where lines will go, so the outline of course. But then where there's a focal discontinuity, so you remember we talked about this before. There's a big focal discontinuity here between the whole object and the background, so that's why we get the thick line around the edge. But then there are sub-focal discontinuities, say between the lateral incisor here and the canine beside it. There's a slight focal discontinuity there, so you'd give a line in there. And also because the teeth are separate elements, I want you to outline all of the teeth. Now you can't see exactly where they articulate with the jaw, so you have to look at the photos for that. You can see a little bit here, the edge of the alveolar surface. So you have to draw those lines in. But then you have to decide, in this big cut here, this broken piece, I would probably draw some sort of line going in here that fades out, but it's also going to be reinforced by heavy stippling in this core shadow region there. But for something like this, where I've got halftone going to core shadow, I wouldn't draw a line around that. That would just be a gradation of shading to show the form change. So let me show you one more thing and then we'll take a break. So you're going to render this out, and this is going to be your main guide for drawing. But I also want you to render out the same jaw, or the same view, and you're going to put that matte shader on it too. So I'm going to go back here, I've right-clicked on it, say Apply Existing Material, Matte Shader. And so you can see the difference is this acts more like a real object. The light just goes smoothly over the surface and it fades into the core shadow region. I'm going to turn my fill light on again. So for this one you probably need the fill light just to bring in that. And so if I render this, let me just save that last render. So if I render this again, wait. So now you get something that looks more realistic in the way the surface is acting. It's not like a cartoon with sharp fall off between the different light regions. But the reason I want you to render this out is because I don't want you to draw yours like a cartoon. There are some areas where there's going to be a sharp drop off, but remember we were looking here before where it was light struck region going into halftone region here. But you can see it's a gentle gradation between them. So this is going to be not the one you trace, but you can look at as a guide. So where there's going to be a sharp change of color, of density, be an area like this, where you've got core shadow and then suddenly the light struck region. But here, where you've got light struck going gradually into halftone, I don't want to see those sharp edges between the light regions. You want them to grade into each other by varying the density as you go. So this one you can print out just as a guide to draw from. The other one you're really going to be tracing and using those regions as a way to know where to put your stipples. And I think you'll be surprised. You'll actually probably be able to produce something very professional looking. Not that you should be surprised that you can do that, but I haven't seen those yet, so who knows. Just before we stop for a break, because it's 10 after 11 now, I just wanted to quickly go in and look at some examples of stippling. We're not going to do stippling or anything today, but I just wanted to look at this now that we've looked at the model. So these are ones I just grabbed off the internet, people have done, but some ones that show some nice work. Things I was just talking about. So here if we look at, I'm going to do this with the mouse so you can see. So this is being lit from the upper left. It's kind of a strong, almost a raking light, so you know the light is pushed towards the mandible a little bit. But so you can see that she's drawn a strong outline going around it and used some internal lines. So here at the alveolar process here, you can see she's used line work here to separate this focal discontinuity where there's the cavity, where the tooth is missing. She's done some line work inside I probably wouldn't quite agree with, like this line, this oblique line coming down here. Oops. I don't think is necessary. That could live on its own with shading. But then other areas you see a gradation from a light struck region into a halftone. But then you see sharp drop-offs between light struck into core shadow where there's this occluding ridge here. You can see some examples of reflected light here. So the tooth has got its light struck region here and then its core shadow, light struck, core shadow, but then a little bit of reflected light in there. You can see right in there. And that helps tell us that the tooth turns away from us. So that's the kind of detail that I want to see. Even down here, you can see the core shadow, but then some lightness in this area here, just to pick up that edge as it recedes from us. A real professional paleontological illustrator avoids trying to overlap stipples and tries to keep them all separate but dense. That's almost impossible. Like this is a little bit sloppy, some of this stuff, but it's still pretty good. If we look at another skull, so here's some kind of dino thing. This one uses shading really nicely to bring the foreground elements towards us and uses the shading to push the internal pieces away from us. You can see that this artist is using some reflected light down here. They've used these black regions to show, it looks like, I'm not sure what they're trying to show there, but it might be areas that are missing. But line work has been used to show separate skeletal elements. We don't have that, so we don't need to draw that in. You can see that the alveolar process here is casting a core shadow onto the teeth, so we get this extra shading down here. So this is one of the nicest ones I found. This looks like an old one, but you can see this bright light-struck region. So one thing I want you to think about, and we're going to have a chance to practice stippling next class, but you have to set your value range. So generally speaking, the way I do something like this is that I set my midtone region first. So I would decide that, this is sort of my midtone, and this is the density for middle gray. Because it's all just black and white, but when you kind of squint your eyes, then it resolves into grays. And so if this is my density for midtone, then I only have to go a little bit darker to get core shadow, and then a little bit less to get light struck region. So this person shows a real nice subtlety here, and you can see they're not using line work to draw this, but like a sharp fall off between a sort of light struck into core shadow directly. And then here, this is being shadowed by the nasal bones here, and you've got nice core shadow in here fading into sort of halftone into light struck. And if you just look down here, I'm not sure what this piece is, like the styloid or something, but there's a strong core shadow, but you see this little rim of light down here? This is very important for showing off the form, and that's the reflected light that I want you to try and capture too. Same, I guess this is the styloid. So here's the core shadow here, and then this little reflected light tells us it's round. If it was flat, then there would be no surface turning away from us to capture this reflected light. And then this one's pretty good too. It's got a nice gradation here going from core shadow, and you can see how she's done it so it's a sharp fall off on this side between light struck and core shadow, but down here it grades into the halftone region. So there's no sharp fall off in this region, but you do know there's a sharp shape here. Strong, so here's an example of the silhouette profile, and then here's a strong internal focal discontinuity between the zygomatic arch and the temporal fossa and inside the orbit. She's got line work here showing the alveolar process separating the teeth out. So I'd like to see you doing that too. It doesn't have to be quite that strong. That's a little strong for me, but some reflected light in here you can see on the occipital, And then here on this big canine, see light struck, core shadow, and then this faint line of reflected light. And then the shadow being cast by the canine onto the mandible tells us both about the form of the canine, its position from the mandible, and the shape of the mandible too. So yours isn't as complicated as this one, but I want you to think about this kind of stuff. Look at these images and think about how they're showing the form when they do this kind of drawing. Okay? Any questions? Okay, so I'm just going to stop the recording.